Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Society for Conservation Biology's Impact Evaluation Working Group monthly seminar on conservation impact evaluation and implementation science. My name is Alan Blackman. I work at the Inter-American Development Bank, and for this semester and the next one, I'm going to be co-hosting the seminar series with Julia Jones at Bangor University. So we're going to be switching off and hosting every other one. A little bit of background on the working group. Its aim is to advance evidence-based biodiversity conservation efforts around the globe by supporting the adoption of counterfactual approaches and improving the understanding the impacts of conservation actions and interventions. So you can find out more about the working group on its brand new website, which is at the URL you see on your screen, scb-impact.org. You can also follow the working group on X, on Blue Sky, and on LinkedIn. So the website, I really encourage you to check it out. It's got a lot of really interesting information, including 3 or 4 years worth of recordings of these seminars, which have been given by some of the top folks working in this field. Also want to let you know that the working group is expanding, and so there are opportunities to get involved if you're interested. The working group's looking for board members, folks to lead on community and engagement, on conference and events, and on volunteer engagement. And there's also volunteer opportunities for folks that are interested in working on the research library and on research briefings. So please check out the website and you can find out how to get involved in those things if you're interested. So our last seminar was in May, and we heard from Gonzalo Pons, who's the Director of Innovations for Poverty Action's Climate and Environment Program, and he was telling us about that program. Today, we're really excited to have with us Ben Groom, who's going to be talking about the impact of overlapping environmental policies in tropical rainforests. And I'll introduce Ben in just a second. But first, I just want to mention a few ground rules. So Ben's going to talk for about a half an hour, and then we'll have 20 minutes at the end for Q&A. So if you'd like to ask a question, please type your question into the chat. And Elias, I think, is going to be moderating the Q&A, and he'll read your question to Ben. You can also, we'll have a live transcription, and this seminar, like all of the ones in the past that I just mentioned, is going to be recorded and it'll be posted on the working group's website. You can also engage with us through social media using hashtag Tuesdays with Team Counterfactual with the tag IDO Impact at IDO Impact. So let me just briefly introduce Ben. He's an applied economist. His research focuses on biodiversity and climate change. His current position is Dragon Capital Chair in Biodiversity Economics at the University of Exeter. Before that, he was a professor at LSE, London School of Economics. He's also had visiting positions at the University of Helsinki, University of London, and the Autonomous University of Barcelona. He has a lot of experience working in policy settings, including as a consultant or researcher for various departments in the UK, Department of Transportation, Environment, ODI. He's worked for the UN, the OECD, WWF, and a bunch of other institutions. He's got a wide range of publications, including in top field journals like the Journal of Environmental Economics and Management, and top interdisciplinary journals like Science and Nature and PNAS. His PhD and his master's in economics are from UCL, University College London, and his bachelor's in economics is from Sheffield University. So we're really excited to have Ben join us, and please take it away. The floor is yours, Ben.
Thank you very much. Yes, you can see the presentation now, yeah? So that was a very nice introduction. Thanks very much, Alan. and it's such a great pleasure to be here at this this sort of seminar series, which I think I've been looking at with great envy in some respects at the way it's been put together and its objectives and so on. I think it's an amazing seminar series, and I'm very pleased to be here. I hope I do it justice. So you mentioned that I've got a wide range of publications. The sort of downside of that is that sometimes you don't go as deeply into things as you possibly would like to. I have wide-ranging interests. But today, I want to talk about our interests. This is work with Lorenzo Silecci, who's at IEU, that's in Madrid, Business School in Madrid, Charles Palmer at the LSE. We've been working on sort of program evaluation of deforestation-related policies for a while. This one is about overlapping environmental policy. So our interest is really in, what is the impact of area-based type policies which are overlapping on one another. It's work that's part of the BioAD project, which is the economics of biodiversity additionality. You're going to hear the word additionality a few times here. And this is the first time I've presented this paper, and that's like if I was an actor, you'd probably be better off seeing me on the third night rather than the first night. So I'm getting my that's probably why I'm not an actor, but I'm getting my excuses in early. This is the first time it's been presented, and it's really work in progress, I'd say. So let's get on with it. Here's the overview. Our motivation here is broadly speaking, stepping back, is that when is area-based conservation policy additional? When did it do something that wasn't going to happen anyway? This is a question which is fraught with different kind of, which is something this seminar series, of course, knows all about, but with different problems on identification of impact. So this with area-based policies and protected areas, for instance, location bias is a key problem. That these are not randomly assigned areas, and so sort of naive comparisons are not really very useful in terms of understanding their impact. So once you do try and start handling this sort of causal question a bit better, then what we find is that protected areas tend to have low additionality. And then in other sort of contexts, area-based policies, ABP, they only appear to be additional when they're under sort of some kind of economic pressure. So when there's something to resist, actually, rather than having paper parks or what have you. Wonderful survey by Matthias Reinhardt and colleagues in 2024 gives a nice overview of all of these different issues and papers that have tried to deal with that. The other issue that we are interested in is that the sort of spatio-temporally overlapping policies, and this complicates the objective evaluation of policies quite a lot, particularly in tropical settings where things are complicated enough already. There are many overlapping policies in tropical countries. You think about Brazil, where you have sort of municipal level policies and government level policies, and even down to sort of project level, which are all happening in the same sort of space. Sub-Saharan Africa, this rather nice paper by Malte Ladovic, which is talks about sort of overlapping concessions, forestry concessions, conservation areas, mining concessions, and such like, which in his case determine the sort of the classification of different protected areas and so on. And then again, in Indonesia, which is going to be our case here, you have sort of protected areas, you have protection forests, you have on top of that moratoria on palm oil, all of which are overlapping in space. So that's the kind of we hope to say something general by looking at the Indonesian case about these many overlapping policies that exist out there. We see evidence of the impact of weakening of policies. So the PADDD here is about downsizing, downgrading, and degazetting of protected areas, and where that happens. The paper by Kellis et al. And various papers by them tends to show that this does raise deforestation as the protection is weakened, particularly when this protected area is under pressure from development, right? But what we find is there's no clear-cut evidence on policy strengthening, particularly. So when you get protected areas or protection levels of policy sort of being strengthened in some way. So that's really what we're going to look at here. And again, the previous evidence has relatively short time periods, time frames, and so on. And that's another advantage we have in our case here. So what's our research question? The relevance here. So our research question is, what is the additionality of area-based policy layering? And we really want to answer the question of sequencing as well. What order should these things happen in tropical ecosystems? So are policy overlaps additional? Do area-based policies bite under developmental pressure? How do policy overlaps interact with rapid agricultural development? And which sequences of policies work best? That's really our overall objective. Now, this has high relevance in the sense that, you know, we always learn something from well executed. I think it's well executed quasi experimental results to tell us how, you know, what happened in the past. But we also think that these results can tell us something about the future as well. So efficient siting, temporal rollout of environmental protection, whether, where, and when policy strengthening is needed in areas of like high developmental pressure. All right. So that's what we're after here. So what do we actually do? We do an analysis in Indonesia of policy layers under development pressure. So firstly, we do what we think of as to begin with as multiple layers. So we look at the impact of protected areas on protection forest, which are 2 layers of protection. We then move on to look at single layer, like the resilience of protection forests, which is a lower level designation to development pressure. And then we discuss, we haven't done the analysis yet, because this is work in progress, of the sequencing of policy. So do we have, when we have protection forest, does it make a difference when the mill comes first, then the protected area, or vice versa? Okay. And we use, in order to identify the impact of different layered policies, we use a temporal arrival of protected areas and palm oil mills for identification. Okay, here's the context. Indonesia, third largest tropical forest in the world, 88 million hectares of natural forests. 2019, 56 million of lowland, rich in biodiversity. You know, it's important globally, this forest. The least remaining, Indonesia has the least remaining primary forest of the tropical areas, largely due to sort of expansion of agriculture, palm oil, and logging, etc. But other important things about it is peatland, you know, lots of carbon stored there. So it's a big concern, this area in its own right. We're using it as a way of identifying policy, the impact of policy overlaps, but this makes it individually kind of important as well. Here's Indonesia forest estate in 1990, right? So more green, more forest. Here it is in 2021. Here's the deforestation. It's the difference between the two, which is pretty extensive, of course, but mainly in Sumatra and Kalimantan. These are the areas that we're going to be focusing on empirically anyhow. Not so much in Western Papua, as we see in the right-hand side here. Okay, this is the palm oil expansion. So if you look at deforestation and then you look at the palm oil expansion, you can see that these are really important. Palm oil has been a really important source of deforestation. We all know this. So this is going to be an important part of our study as well. So policy sequencing and layering. Here's how it rolled out in Indonesia. So in 1967, so this is not an exhaustive list of policies and such like, but these are the key ones that we want you to think about. So in 1967, forestry law, legal classification of the entire Indonesian forest estate, Kawasan Hutan, which following its nationalization. So this divides forests into two different types: protection forest, which restricts all commercial use, and production forest, which allows agricultural and resource development. Okay. 1990, the next important piece of legislation for our purposes is the legal basis for protected areas, PAs. So we get national parks, conservation areas, wildlife reserves, etc. All of them overlap with protection forests. There's an overlapping policy here of protection on top of protection forests, protected areas on top of protection forests, right? So it's 12% of terrestrial Indonesian landmass, and many of these were, as we'll see in a second, were established after 1990. Okay, so here's a map of the non-forest, the protection forest, and the production forest, and you can see, if you can remember those deforestation maps again, you know, a good use has been made of the production forest. And I guess it's an empirical question as to how successful the protection forest has been. Here are the protected areas, which again, you can see this, you can't see this, but believe me, they're only on top of protection forest. All right, here's how the protected areas rolled out since 1923 or something like that. You can see there's a big explosion of these towards the end of the 90s. This line here is 1990, which is when we have data on land use cover from, and then in the late 90s, there's a financial crisis, the IMF get involved, Suharto regime ends, etc., and there's a big explosion of protected areas in that period. So we're going to be exploiting this sequential variation of implementation of protected areas in our analysis. All right, so first piece of evidence that we want to show you is the following. We want to look at the overlap between protected areas and production forests and see whether or not protected areas had any additional effect compared to protection forests, which were PTFs. Yeah. So these we've dated. We put together a data set on this, which never existed before. They're all on top of the protection forest as phased implementation, which allows us to use a kind of classic, which has now become a classic, Callaway-Santana estimator. And we use just the protection forest as controls here. So really what we're looking at here is the marginal effect of layering the protected area on top of protection forest. Okay, the data set is the European moist forest data, and this gives us as outcome variables undisturbed forest, deforestation, and degradation, which is just any kind of disturbance which isn't deforestation. Okay. So these are so I'm just going to go straight into it without explaining the methods beyond the fact that this is a diff approach. So we have treatment and control, and we follow this over time, and we test, we can illustrate sort of parallel trends up to a point, and such like. So identification assumptions will be made clear here. No, whether the extent to which the assumptions are met will be made clear here. And I'm just going to go straight into the results. So these are our treated areas. You can see the protected areas on top of the protection forest in red-ish, orange. And then the darker, well, the black, I guess, is it dark green, is the protection forest. So these are our sort of two treatment control type areas, okay? And we're just looking at Kalimantan and Sumatra. This is the effect of what we're calling a naive result. I'll tell you why in a second, of protection on protected areas compared to protection forest. So you see that this is an event analysis from the staggered diff in diff, where you see sort of moderate effects in the short run, and then with longer time horizons, you get larger effects here. So if you integrate underneath these effects, the cumulative effect is about 4%. 4% more undisturbed forests. You can disentangle that into deforestation and degradation, and from this you really sort of say you have to be careful of the y-axis scaling here, but really what this says is that most of that effect is coming from reduced degradation rather than reduced deforestation. Okay, but that's one thing, and it's not the thing I really want to focus on, but that's an interesting study, and we have interesting data there, and it's to some extent you could argue that this is causal inference going on because we've deployed all of the methods that one would expect, and you saw that broadly speaking there was the trends beforehand were very similar, so it seems to satisfy the DID assumptions. However, if we're calling it naive because if the location bias is there in the original siting of protected areas, it can't rule out sort of further selection issues. There are two possible things that we're estimating here: strengthening protection, which is a genuine treatment effect, or weakening of protection on the unlayered areas. So, this could mean that there's big spillovers as a result of protected areas into the protection forest, which we haven't really looked at yet. But that's not the way we wanted to go. The other issue is that it begs the question, what was the effect of the original layer, the protection forest as well, the single layer, rather than these kind of double layered policies here? And then also the question of does protection bite under developmental pressure? We haven't really controlled in this previous analysis for the pressures that arrive at the doorstep of protected areas and protection forest from agricultural development. So we could go in a number of different ways here. We could make the previous analysis better. What we've decided to do for now is to think about this first layer, the single layer, like what is the effect of protection forest on forest cover and such like. So how do we do this? Protection forest came into place, as I said, in 1967. Our data on forest cover starts in 1990. We can't use the temporal rollout of protection forest in order to identify this, so we need some other strategy. So what we do is we use the supply chain structure of Indonesian agricultural sector, particularly palm oil production, which is the main driver of deforestation in Indonesia, in order to use a different, what we think is exogenous shock to identify the impact of this layer of protection. How this works is as follows. Probably many of you on this call know this way better than me. This is where my sort of thin knowledge about lots of different things could trip me up. But basically, this is the structure. This is the important part of the structure of the palm oil business that we're interested in. And the key issue here is that the way in which palm oil gets transported to local mills. The FFBs are fresh fruit bushes, and then you've got this kind of crude palm oil that gets produced and exported out from the mills. So we're going to use this link here as a way of identifying it. How do we do that? Well, first of all, we have data on the location of mills from various papers from before. This is one by Benedict et al. You can see from 1990 the number of mills and how they roll out over time. So we have this sort of staggered implementation here over space and time. So we have the data for this, but the crucial aspect is the following, is that the palm oil supply chain is such that the palm oil production is only feasible within 50 kilometers of a mill due to perishability of the fruit. So because of this, the set of feasible land that becomes under pressure from the location of a mill is sort of limited, constrained to this sort of, in a sense, a concentric circle around the mill. So there's only land plots within that concentric circle in protection forests that are at risk. And what we see here is that there is an overlap between this circle around any particular mill and many protection forests. It's not just on production forests that you get mills. You get an overlap of this sort of feasible harvesting area or production area into protection forests. So we're going to use that margin where the circle around a mill cuts across protection forest in order to identify the impact either side of that margin. And that tells us something about, that will tell us something about whether or not encroachment is happening, the extent to which protection forest is actually protecting. So just sort of to draw a picture, this is a genuine map underneath, but we've just put a circle on top. Imagine there's a mill in the middle here. The dotted line is like 20 kilometers, which is the data that we use is outside of 20 kilometers. The solid line is the 50 kilometers. So we think of that as the feasible area inside and unfeasible production outside. And you'll see that in this figure, this line of feasibility cuts through some protection forest here in certain places. So that allows us to identify sort of treatment and control, in the sense of treatment being potential development pressure, and control being the absence of pressure in protection forests. So that's what we use as our treatment and control here, T1 and C1, to think about the effect on protection forests. We also do something else, which is to look at the production forest, which is this purple area here, and then we have the equivalent sort of C2, C2 areas there, where outside of the circle is not feasible and inside of the circle is feasible. Obviously, this is subject to some noise around this line. It's not as sharp as we're making out, but it's well established sort of feasibility constraint. Okay, so that's what we're going to do to identify the impact of this protection forest on conservation outcomes. So what we do is the following. We do the same thing, staggered boundary, diff in diff, using non-threatened PTF as the control units for threatened PTF, PTF being protection forest. This is our T1 versus C1 effect. It measures sort of the pressure the effect of pressure on this protected layer. Now, of course, the second part is, we should be measuring this against what happens in non-protection forests. And so we do a similar design there, sort of staggered boundary DID on the production forest, which is the PDF here. Okay. All right, that allows us to measure what we think of as a pure development effect. How much, if you were allowed to produce, how much would you produce, given that you now have the feasibility to do it? And then what one can do is take the difference between the two to understand, broadly speaking. So this is like a triple diff, diff in diff, triple diff. Anyway, you know what I mean, DDD. Following this other paper by Santana and colleague, which kind of tells you something about the impact of protection forest compared to a counterfraction of production forest. Okay. So let's see the results here. On the left, we have the development pressure effect, we're calling, which is within the protection forest, right? And we see that either side of that boundary, the share of undisturbed forest is less in the sort of area where you have pressure compared to outside. And if you look at the pure development effect, then you have a larger effect. So this is sort of telling you that, the effect of having this potential in production forests is a pure development effect. What this is telling you on the left is that the protection forest is actually having something of an effect on pushing back on the development pressure here. So this is, if you take the integral of this, it's something like 3% more undisturbed forest in the sort of protection forest without the development pressure. On the other side here, you're sort of saying, the pure development effect is saying the same kind of thing, but it's just saying that within that circular circle, you have, up to 30%, but if you integrate over this, it's about 12% as the cumulative effect, 12% lower forest cover on the inside of that circle there. So that's interesting. We can now sort of split that up into development pressure and a pure development effect. So, sorry, what am I saying? We can split that up into deforestation versus degradation. So the deforestation is these two figures here on development pressure and the pure development effect. And we'll see here that that the deforestation effect is not really pronounced, as that is not what is being prevented by the protection forest in this case, and the pure development effect is more or less the same as it was before in terms of deforestation. But what these results really tell you is that the large, a large amount of this within the protection forest is coming from degradation. A small amount is coming from degradation in terms of pure development. So what this is saying is that within protection forest, the main driver of the difference is on prevention of degradation, and in the pure development effect is driven mainly by deforestation. So this is something we would sort of, broadly speaking, we'd expect the second thing. On the other side, what this is telling you is we haven't investigated this yet, but this is probably to do with smallholder incursions into these protection forests, these viable protection forests. Okay, so those are the results that we have so far on the first layer, right, which is protection forest, and in principle these could be sort of compared to the ones we had in the first study on protected areas. So we'd have these estimates of what happens in both layers here. But again, we're not at that position where we're not quite, this is work in progress and there's still a bit more work to be done. So I wouldn't sort of say that we're solid on all of these results, but you can see where we're going on all of this. just for some robustness on the second part here, we varied the size of this outer ring, which defines the data that we're using. So we went from 20 kilometers in the interior and then various radiuses out from that. And basically, what happens is the treatment effect sort of increases as you increase the ring size, which is kind of what you'd expect. Okay, so this is sort of a good. We feel it's a decent result for both protection forests and production forests on the right. Okay, if you take the difference between the two, we argue that this is sort of telling you the full effect of the protection forest compared to had it been production forest. So it's the difference between the two. And in the end, if you just integrate underneath and get the cumulative effect here, it's approximately 8-9% increase in undisturbed forest as a consequence of that protection forest area. Okay. We feel like this is a reasonably well identified result, although obviously there's work to be done. But the thing that's different about this part than the protected areas analysis that we did is that we really controlled for the pressure from agriculture that drives deforestation, which was not necessarily the case in the previous one. And that's a really important aspect when we're trying to understand the cause and impact of these different area-based policies. Are we comparing like with like? And we think we are with our using these sort of effectively, let's say, arguably exogenous rollout of mills over time. Right. Now, those are two separate layers that we've been looking at: the PA on the protection forest, and then the protection forest in its own right. Of course, the next obvious question to us is to think about the policy layering and the development policy layer and development sequencing. So, like obviously, development and policy occur in different sequences. Sometimes protected areas are a response to agricultural development. Sometimes they're trying to preempt agricultural development in these tropical contexts. And it's well understood that these development pressures play a role in the effectiveness of area-based policies per se. There's a rather nice paper by Kellis et al. In ecological economics, for instance, which makes this bargaining point. But and there are policy choices to be made here. So protected areas can be layered over protection forests where mills bite, right at the frontier there, or they can be put somewhere a ways away from palm oil expansion frontier. And of course, we can look at those dynamics and see which of those is more effective in the end. So at the moment, we haven't done this yet, but this is what we'd like to have feedback on all of this, but also in particular this. There are specific temporal dynamics. We could have protection forest followed by a protected area, followed by a palm oil mill, right? So conservation strengthening before agricultural frontier expands. Or we could have it the other way around, which is protection forest, palm oil mill, and then responsive protected area. And we have an identification strategy which builds on what we've just done before, which is going to disentangle these two sort of sequences of policies. And we're hoping that this will basically give us some information about how to plan the future, how things have turned out in the past, but also how to plan future conservation policies. I say conservation policies, but really what this is all about is balancing, the development side and the environment side in a way that is sort of efficient. And that is really what we think about as economists, unfortunately. I say unfortunately, but we're sort of a bit hard-nosed about that. This is an environment development trade-off, and really as environmental economists, we're thinking about how best to make that trade-off. So that is it. I think that was a reasonable conclusion, actually. So thanks very much, and look forward to your comments.
Thanks so much, Ben. I think, Elias, you're going to be moderating the Q&A.
Yeah, so please, if you have a question, try to put it in the chat. Please, Ben, put on your slides again. I guess we will have to roll back
okay.
at some point, yes.
I will do that.
Yeah, I think the the first questions is about a little bit about the context, right? So for example, Paul asked, right, before presenting the results of the first DID analysis, you did explain why some of the PTFs were assigned additional protection designation and others were not. So why, first of all, why do some of them receive protection and other areas don't, right? And does that inform us about the DID assumption that you tested with the pre-treatment parallel trends, right? But still a little bit of context would be helpful here.
Yes. Okay.
And yeah, and then also.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I guess one can look at that in terms of the purpose of the protected area, the status of protected areas, which is really to change the function of that area from to refocus into areas of sort of higher biodiversity and species richness and such like. These conservation areas. So, some of them are also there because of ecosystem services as well. So there you have a kind of a sense of like why some of these areas, these aren't necessarily sort of exogenously allocated in space, right? So, but I guess we overcome that a lot more compared to because we're only using protection forests as our counterfactual here. I think that there's a sense in which there's a bit more comparability there. But this is a good question here. I guess also like one has to think about that period of time where the protected areas were rolled out. So there is another purpose here, I guess, which was that post financial crisis 1998, there was a lot of support coming in from the IMF. And with that support came, support for Indonesia came conditions as well on protected areas. So that's one thing. And one of the reasons, I guess, why that happened, and like my colleague Charles Palmer, and actually even Lorenzo, who's on the call here, I noticed they know a bit more about this than I do. But these two things came hand in hand. There was a kind of development impetus, and then there was a protected area impetus as well.
So the other question was a little bit more context on the protected forests itself, right? What do they actually, by regulation, prevent from, right? Versus the production forest, right? And then I have a follow-up question on that, right?
Right.
Like what is because there is a lot of different rolling over from protection forest to production forest, right? During the 2000 years, right? In order to enable palm oil expansion, right? The reclassification of production forest, right? So if you have a little bit more context about this.
So are you saying there's reclassification of protection forest to production forest?
So this is the second question. The first question, what does it actually protect the forest from, right? So what is the regulations?
All right. So so this is not something I know a huge amount about, but I can just say that like there's a fiscal implication of having protected areas status, which means that more resources are available in order to serve their particular purpose, which is conservation of biodiversity and to some extent ecosystem services. So that's but the key there. Economic question there is like where do these resources come from, and do these detract from the resources that came from protection forest, right? So this is why we're concerned about that first analysis, because if that's going on, then that's a clear kind of fiscal spillover from one to the other jurisdiction, which one needs to investigate much further, I'd say. So it's a really good question, and we have it in mind. But we're not quite there yet in terms of addressing that in full.
And the protection forest, which layer are you using? Like from in the beginning of 2000 or like at the end of the 2014-18 of your time frame, right? Because there is reclassification, right? And in order to enable oil palm expansion in these areas.
Yes. So that bit I don't know about on the data side. Maybe Lorenzo can help us there. But we use the full range of because we're using this staggered implementation in order to identify the treatment effect. we're looking over time at protected areas coming in cumulatively over time, right? So we're using this time series dimension in order to establish the impact, right? Of course, that means we have to have careful treatment definitions of what our control groups are, but that's really the essence of the Callaway-Santana estimator, which tries to updates the control groups through time, so that you're not, you really are trying to compare apples with apples and not mix up your control groups with later treatment groups, So yeah, that's the way in which it works. On the reversals of protected areas, the reclassification this is something we haven't addressed yet at all. So it's just as well that it's been raised.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to answer, Lorenzo, that's fine. I don't see many new questions yet. Yes, but so it's about the reclassification of
for sure.
forests, not protected areas.
Yeah.
Got you. Yeah, I got that question. Yeah, we're using the earliest available layer that we could find, which is early 2000s. I have a new one that's about 2014, I want to say, where you can see the reclassification happen there in the production forest, especially. I would argue that, I mean, of course, it's never going to be perfect. So it's never going to be the 1967 one, right? But any reclassification would eliminate protected areas and turn them into production areas, right? And so in terms of our results, that would imply that basically now you can deforest much more, right? On those production forest ones. These are never really let me think it straight, but I think they're never really used in the estimation strategy per se. Like, so if in any case you would have like a upper bound, like a lower bound, right? So that's your answer there. Like, so we're using an early 2001, and the assumption, like the underlying assumption, is that the protection forest status was reformed in 1999. So that's kind of like the status quo that we're looking at. And we do know where reclassification happened, so we can track that for sure. And then I think you had an earlier one as well, where you wanted to know what's actually the function change that's happening there. So protected forest kind of allowed limited uses, but no deforestation, no use for agricultural development. So limited logging, limited like disturbances there. Whereas protected areas, of course, is a stricter definition. And I think that's also tied into Paul's question in the chat about fundamentally whether protected forests have different probabilities of being turned into a protected area. And I think we take that point, and we will do some work to kind of equalize protected forests and protected areas when it comes to estimating those.
Okay, let me read out another question that just came in. In the second analysis, do you exclude the possible protected area parcels in the circles and rings? And what is the unit of analysis, the parcels or the grid?
But yeah, we definitely exclude those from the analysis. So we're very careful about that. The unit of analysis is the grid.
Yeah, we're using hexagons of size 36 kilometers squared. So like 5 kilometer side. Well, yeah. Radius, really. Yeah.
Yeah. Level 6.
Yeah, you don't really see them in the maps because they are very fine at that kind of aggregate level. But fundamentally, like all that data is aggregated to this hexagonal grid, which also allows us to like really trace distances well, because it's consistent over distances compared to a square grid, whereby distance between a centroid and a corner will be higher than a centroid and the side of a square.
So let's keep up a little bit more with the technical questions and the data. Like, and I was also wondering about your mix of deforestation and degradation outcome. So does it really, one question aims at, is the land cover change data you're using doing a good job on distinguishing between forest and palm oil trees, right?
So it's funny, Lorenzo and I had this discussion just before the presentation, and we think yes, basically, because the sort of undisturbed is basically pristine forest, right? And anything else than that is basically gone through some disturbance. And if that's gone through, in order to become palm oil, it has been through some kind of disturbance. And so we're basically excluding, I think the data basically excludes palm oil plantations. However, there is other data on palm oil plantations which we could use, and we can basically undertake robustness tests to check this. But that's a very good question, one which we've been discussing already. And we're pretty happy with it, basically. That's the
So the EU data has a category that we're not using here, which is regrowth. And I think, like personally, I think, and we have been cross-checking it a little bit, any palm oil plantation will have to, undergo complete deforestation before it's planted. And when it's planted, if anything, it will be picked up by regrowth rather than degradation.
And we're not using regrowth data in this analysis, basically. Yeah. Good questions. I mean, yeah, really, really good questions.
So let me read out again. Yes, so for the analysis in which you quantify the effects of layering the additional protection designation on PTFs, are you assuming each grid cell is independent, or are you cluster estimating your standard errors where the clusters are the PTF polygons? Your confidence intervals look quite narrow for conservation impact evaluation using a DID design. That's true, but some people are lucky. Yes, I still see a lot of conservation impact evaluations on grids and pixels that assume the units are independent. Yes.
Yeah. No, so it's clustered. Yeah, it's clustered. But basically, I mean, the sample size is doing. Oh, we're not. So he's waving his finger at me, but
no, it's not clustered yet.
Done by the sample size here. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not clustered yet. We will cluster at the mill catchment level. I think that's the standard way we want to look at it. Cluster at the level of treatment. So everything within a mill's catchment level will be will be clustered. But yeah, so far, kind of pretty naive estimation for now. We just wanted to see whether the direction of the effect is the correct one or it respects our priors.
I mean, yeah, I would always the catchment area, the district, the Conley, distance weighted clusters. Yeah, so all of that will always help then.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, on this one, would you have any preference? Because I think the catchment area would be the one where these pixels and these grids are treated by, in our framework, are treated by the investment in a mill. Right. And so the ones that are within a mill's catchment area, I think will undergo the same kind of processes. And that's, for me, the appropriate way of clustering standard errors, right, at the level of treatment, so to say. But of course, we can test robustness to other.
Yes, exactly. I think the correct answer is the level of treatment, but this is unclear, right? Yeah. So is it the protected area? Is it protected forest? Is it the grid cell? Is it the mill setting, right? Depending on the analysis, I would, try to... So another question, did you run a placebo for the mill analysis, e.g., for example, using a different catchment radius, 80 kilometers? I have seen this in your results. Maybe we can go back to that. Using different catchment radius.
Can I take this one too, actually?
Yeah, go for it, Lorenzo.
Yeah, so basically, so far we're only using 50 kilometers, kind of like the classic feasibility of bringing palm oil, fresh fruit bunches to a mill. What we do want to do, though, is to use underlying road networks to estimate properly travel times to mills, so that we will have a gradient of distances that it also time and spatially varying according to the road networks. And then we can really first of all, pin down in terms of travel time, what's the appropriate catchment area of a mill, which should not be radial anyway. And then we can kind of vary that buffer or kind of vary that maximum distance to assess robustness. This was just to the first kind of 50-kilometer standard literature for perishability of fresh fruit bunches was just the first intuition that we had.
And this is just, it's just varying this outer ring, basically, right? And that, yeah. So yeah, that needs checking. That needs a test on the 50-kilometer robustness, basically. Yeah.
I think for the next question, that is great. Like, what is your recommendation to the Indonesian government based on your research? Yes, so I know there's, for example, one research now on the price elasticities, right, of palm oil and how that could be integrated with protection schemes, right, and payments. So what I mean, I know that you are still not differentiating between expanding protection first or later, right?
Yeah, right. So that's the objective. So we don't have anything really on prices here, right? So we're not thinking about like incentives necessarily. These are kind of quantity-based policies, of course, area-based policies. Our previous work looked at the moratorium in Indonesia, which was a kind of an agreement between Norway and the Indonesian government to reward financially for changes in deforestation rate. And our paper basically said that there was a small effect of the moratorium, but very, very tiny, right? But given the amount of money that was exchanged, it was a decent return on the investment for the Norwegians, at least. Here, what we want to say is something more about, how you organize protection in a dynamic agricultural landscape effectively. So it's about, what are the most efficient ways to handle the twin objectives of conservation and development. So we would hope that our estimates in the end on the sequencing side would say something about that. I mean, that also says something about the conservation policies that work and that don't. So that's one thing. On the stuff that you've seen, the results that we've seen here, I wouldn't say anything about policy on the basis of these yet, because it's work in progress and we're just working things through. But what I think is important to understand is that there are effects of different layers of area-based policies, and we're just sort of teasing out these different effects. So sometimes it looks as if additional marginal policies have positive effects. But then the question is, like, which of these types of protection is going to have the biggest marginal effect if you were going to implement some now? So we can hopefully in the end say something about that. Maybe it is the fact that protection forest is pretty good in terms of conservation outcomes compared to that marginal layering on top. Or something, or maybe the other way around. So those are the kind of policy questions that we really want to answer there. It's like about sequencing and layers.
Yeah, I would fully agree before closing this, because we have 4 minutes left. Yeah, so I think the real interesting thing is, like, in a context of small effects, right? What is the resilience of these policies, right? So you could interpret mills as an economic shock also, right? And then how are they protection in this context, right? In the context of shocks and pressures that are coming in, right? To
Agreed.
that didn't have pressure before.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's right, exactly. And I think those are like really key questions when it comes to understanding the impacts of protected areas. Is like, first of all, overcome the location bias issue. Then you need to think about, okay, what happens in the future when the frontier arrives at the door? And that's sort of the kind of thing that we're trying to get our heads around with this paper, with this work.
All right, thank you very much. And let me hand over to Alan.
Yeah, just thank you so much, Ben and Lorenzo and team. Really interesting presentation, really ambitious. It's great to see you guys making progress on this. Tune in next month, and I think we are not allowed to announce who the speaker is, but you'll be hearing from us by email. And thanks again. Have a great day, everybody.